I don't understand you." The receptionist's irritation sliced through the marble lobby of Westbridge Corporation. Asher Lowell, a deaf entrepreneur in his 30s, moved his hands with practiced urgency signs born of a lifetime spent unheard. His eyes, heavy with resignation, searched for even a flicker of recognition. The passing staff offered none. A few smirked, others walked faster, eager to escape the discomfort of his silence. Against the wall stood Milan Collins, 24, the timid intern who had mastered invisibility. She watched, torn, as Elodie Vance, her sharp-tongued colleague, hissed, "Stay out of this. It's not your place." But memory flooded her younger brother Ephraim's pleading gaze when words failed him. The same wound now glimmered in Asher's eyes. Her chest tightened. Her fingers trembled. She stepped forward, shaping words with fragile courage. "Hello, sir. May I help you?" The lobby froze. Above Harlan West, the unyielding CEO watched in silence. Milan Collins was 24, yet within the towering walls of Westbridge Corporation, she could have been a shadow. For 3 months, her days blurred into errands, pouring coffee, making copies, collecting signatures. Her presence was felt only when a task needed doing and forgotten the instant it was complete. She had learned the rhythm of survival walk, lightly speak softly, never linger too long in anyone's gaze. In a place where ambition roared louder than empathy, kindness was often mistaken for weakness. The louder voices rose, the smaller Milan made herself. She shrank into corners during meetings, her ideas left unspoken, her value dismissed before it had a chance to appear. Colleagues overlooked her not out of cruelty but convenience. She was useful when invisible, harmless when silent, and so she wore invisibility like a second skin. Yet beneath the quiet exterior, a restless ache remained, the ache of someone who longed to be seen. At 13, Milan sat cross-legged on the worn carpet of her bedroom, an old computer screen glowing in the dark. She replayed the same grainy videos again and again, watching hands dance in unfamiliar patterns. Her own fingers stumbled clumsy at first, aching with repetition. Still she persisted. Each gesture was an act of love, carved from the silence that had separated her from Ephraim. She whispered the meaning in her heart while her hands fought to keep pace. "You matter." She signed it once, twice, 100 times, until the motion became muscle memory, until the phrase became prayer. Nights stretched long, but Milan did not quit. The world might refuse her brother a voice, but she refused to let him feel voiceless. Her devotion turned practice into ritual into power. The timid girl found strength not in recognition but in the stubborn will to reach across the void. Ephraim Collins had never heard his name spoken aloud. From childhood silence was his companion, a constant barrier between him and the world's noise. His eyes shone bright, yet behind the light lingered solitude. He watched classmates chase each other in laughter, his smile faint, but his body still as though laughter belonged to someone else's life. At home, conversations often rushed past him like trains he could never board. Milan became his station, his only link. Through her halting signs he found entry into a world that had once excluded him. When she stumbled, he laughed gently. When she improved, he clapped his hands with childlike pride. To Ephraim, Milan was not just a sister, but a lifeline. And to Milan, Ephraim was more than family, he was purpose. Every moment spent bridging his silence carved conviction into her soul, the belief that no one should live unseen. Elodie Vance entered every room like she owned it. Her ambition was a weapon sharpened on other people's failures, and she wielded it without hesitation. Meetings were her stage. She cut across colleagues mid-sentence, twisted their ideas into her own, and let the applause fall neatly into her lap. Those who tried to rise beside her soon learned the sting of her dismissal. A raised eyebrow, a barbed comment delivered with casual cruelty, Elodie knew how to reduce confidence to rubble. She thrived in a culture that praised volume over value, and she spoke loudest of all. To Milan Collins she showed only contempt. In Elodie's eyes, Milan was dust, too timid, too small, too harmless to matter. Yet she never missed a chance to remind the intern of her place. Sweet smiles blossomed whenever a manager passed by, but when backs were turned her tongue dripped venom. Elodie was more than a colleague. She was a storm cloud that darkened Milan's sky, a constant reminder that in Westbridge, kindness was weakness and ambition wore a cruel face. Silas Parker had once held a paintbrush. Before budget cuts drove him into security, he'd taught art to restless students, showing them how lines could reveal truth and color could soften pain. Now, in his 60s, he sat at the entrance of Westbridge Corporation, wearing a uniform instead of a smock. He spoke little. His presence was measured not in words but in the steady calm he carried. For most employees, Silas was invisible, the aging guard behind the desk. But for Milan, he was something more. Each morning, as she hurried past, he met her eyes with a faint nod, the kind of gesture that said, "I see you." It was small, almost imperceptible, yet it anchored her in a place that so often erased her. Where others overlooked her, Silas acknowledged her humanity without fanfare, and when he did choose to speak, his words were few but heavy, the kind that stayed echoing long after they were said. He carried the quiet authority of someone who had watched generations stumble, fall, and rise again. To Milan, Silas Parker was not just a guard. He was a silent mentor, a reminder that being seen even by one person could be enough to survive another day. High above the lobby at the top floor of Glass and Steel, Harlan West presided over an empire. The CEO of Westbridge was a figure carved in severity, jaw, set eyes, unyielding smile, rare. His presence commanded silence. His reputation kept challengers at bay. For decades he had built success brick by brick, leaving little room for sentiment. His office gleamed with trophies of achievement, framed contracts, industry awards, photographs with world leaders. Yet something was missing. There were no candid pictures, no signs of a life beyond the corporation. The space spoke of triumphs measured in profit but devoid of warmth. Inside the desk drawer lay what the polished room concealed: a single photograph of a young girl, his daughter, frozen mid-gesture. Her small hands spelled "Trust me" in the language of silence. It was the only fragment of tenderness left in a man who had once known how to love, but had buried it under layers of steel. Harlan West was power personified, yet behind the armor rested a fracture, an old wound that no accolade could heal. And though no one in the building knew it, the moment a shy intern signed her first trembling words in the lobby below, the fracture stirred. Inside Westbridge, Milan drifted like air. Colleagues brushed past without noticing, eyes fixed on brighter stars. Elodie shone effortlessly, her name praised in meetings, her ideas echoed back with admiration. Milan sat in the corner, fingers tapping at a keyboard no one cared to hear. She was present, but not accounted for. The glass offices sparkled with ambition. Promotions went to those loud enough to demand them, ruthless enough to claim them. Milan knew her kindness carried no currency here. She watched the way colleagues laughed at sharp remarks, the way cruelty was disguised as confidence. In her silence, she wondered, is goodness meaningless in a place like this? Her heart wrestled with two truths: the safety of remaining unseen and the ache of wanting visibility. To step forward meant risking ridicule, yet to hide meant erasing herself. The question hung heavy: how long could she endure as a shadow? That evening, Milan stepped into the fading daylight. Ephraim was waiting, perched on the edge of a bench near the company doors. At 16, he carried silence like a second skin, yet his smile shone brighter than any word. When he saw her, his hands moved quickly. "Proud of you." Simple, direct, unshakable. Milan forced a smile, but her eyes betrayed her, red-rimmed from a day of erasure. Ephraim tilted his head, studying her as if to say he knew the battles she wouldn't voice. She knelt, brushing a hand over his shoulder, and for a moment the world shrank to just them. She existed in two lives: inside Westbridge, where she was invisible, and here, where she was cherished. The contrast carved itself deep. Everyone needs at least one person who sees them. Without it, the world is unbearable. The next morning, the marble lobby greeted her with familiar indifference, but Asher Lowell returned carrying the same dignified calm. He moved his hands with quiet determination, hoping for understanding. Milan hesitated, fear whispering reminders of yesterday's invisibility. Still, she stepped forward. Her hands shaped careful signs. Asher's face lit with relief, the lines of weariness softening. He signed back, slow and deliberate. "Thank you. You made me feel heard." The words struck her harder than she expected. For the first time since joining Westbridge, she wasn't a shadow. She was a bridge between silence and recognition, between neglect and compassion. Milan walked back to her desk, the echo of Asher's gratitude ringing louder than any applause she had ever imagined. She had been seen, and that truth carried a new weight. Maybe invisibility was no longer enough. From a distance, Elodie Vance watched the exchange between Milan and Asher, the corner of her mouth curling upward. She had found her opening. By evening, whispers spread like spilled ink. Milan just wanted attention. She staged it to impress the client. The rumor multiplied, fed by nods and knowing glances. By lunchtime the next day it was common talk at crowded tables. "Did you see her?" one colleague muttered. "Sign language really, like a show," another added, rolling their eyes. Milan carried her tray quietly, the words pressing against her ears, though no one spoke to her directly. Each bite of food turned to ash. She sat in silence, throat tight, aware of stares slipping across the cafeteria like shadows. Her brief moment of worth was already being rewritten as vanity. A fracture had opened not in her ability but in the fragile trust of those around her. And fractures once seeded spread fast. The following day, the cafeteria was louder than usual, voices rising with casual cruelty. Milan walked carefully between tables, her tray balanced in shaking hands. Then Elodie struck. A sudden shove disguised as clumsiness sent hot coffee spilling down Milan's white blouse. Liquid spread across fabric, a dark stain blooming like accusation. Laughter sparked at the edges of the room, small cruel bursts that cut deeper than words. Some turned away, unwilling to intervene. Others watched with silent amusement. Milan froze, her cheeks burning. She wanted to vanish, to dissolve into the floor. Elodie's lips curled in mock sympathy. Accidents happen. Not a single voice rose in defense. Not a single hand offered a napkin. The stain marked more than fabric, it marked her place in their eyes, an outsider easy to mock, unworthy of respect. In that moment, humiliation wasn't loud. It was quiet, isolating a silence heavier than noise. That night, Milan sat on her narrow bed, the day replaying in painful fragments. She reached for her phone and called Ephraim. His face filled the screen, framed by quiet confidence far older than his years. He lifted his hands and signed with calm precision. "You're stronger than you think." Milan forced a laugh, masking tears she didn't want him to see. Maybe she whispered, though her voice betrayed the doubt. She signed back slowly, her hands shaking, unsure whether she was convincing him or herself. In her chest, hope flickered, small, fragile, but alive. Yet the weight of failure still pressed down, whispering she wasn't enough. That duality gnawed at her, a brother's unwavering faith on one side, her own relentless fear on the other. She ended the call with a smile, but when the screen went dark, the silence returned heavier than before. The question lingered, could she ever prove him right? The quarterly meeting carried the weight of millions. Asher Lowell had returned this time, not as a visitor, but as a partner ready to finalize a deal that could reshape Westbridge's future. Executives filled the room, their voices hushed with anticipation, their eyes glued to the clock. But the professional interpreter was stuck in traffic. Every passing minute tightened the air. Murmurs spread anxiety, sharpening like static. At the far end, Elodie Vance leaned back in her chair, her smirk blooming. Her gaze slid to Milan, who sat unnoticed in the corner. She mouthed a silent taunt, perfect timing. Then Harlan West's voice cut through the noise. Steady, unquestionable. "Milan, you'll interpret." The words struck like a gavel. Heads turned. Gasps broke the silence. Milan's stomach dropped, her pulse racing to keep up with the demand. There was no room for protest, no chance to prepare. The spotlight she had always avoided now blazed on her with merciless heat. She rose, legs unsteady, the room waiting for her to either rise or collapse. Milan stepped forward, her hands trembling as though the weight of every eye pressed down on her skin. She began to sign, translating words into motion, but nerves betrayed her. Technical terms, tangled fingers, stumbled meaning, fractured in the air. Across the table, Asher's brow furrowed, his gaze tightening with confusion. Each missed phrase carved deeper lines into his expression. The audience caught it, instantly shifts in chairs, sharp exhales, whispers breaking the fragile silence. "She's not ready," someone murmured. From Milan's side, a soft hiss carried, "Told you so." Elodie's voice venom hidden in satisfaction. The room's judgment was louder than any words Milan spoke. Snickers leaked from the corners. A manager shook his head. Confidence drained from her face, replaced by panic. She signed faster, desperate to correct herself, only to stumble again. The harder she tried, the more visible her collapse became. What began as tension unraveled into humiliation. Her voice cracked, almost inaudible. "I'm sorry. I can't." The words sealed her defeat. Milan turned, fleeing the room before anyone could stop her. Doors swung shut behind her, muting the low hum of voices and the quiet laughter she imagined chasing her steps. In the restroom, she pressed her back against the cold wall, sliding down until she folded into herself. Arms wrapped around knees, shoulders shaking, she wept loud, raw sobs she had held back for weeks. In that moment, she wasn't the intern or the interpreter, or even the sister who fought for her brother's voice. She was 13 again, the invisible girl too small to be noticed, too fragile to withstand the world's scorn. The walls seemed to close in, and the echo of her own failure became unbearable. It wasn't just a mistake in translation, it was proof in her mind that she had never belonged here at all. The sobs echoed off tiled walls until a soft knock interrupted them. Milan stiffened, wiping her face with trembling hands. Then came the voice, low, steady, deliberate. Failure isn't falling down. It's refusing to stand up again. The words belonged to Silas Parker. He stepped into view, not with authority but with patience, a folded handkerchief resting in his palm. He held it out without demand, his eyes carrying more comfort than any speech could offer. Milan reached for it hesitantly, the fabric pressed against her wet cheeks. She saw no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet recognition as if he had witnessed this same collapse countless times in young students long ago. For the first time all day she felt the weight in her chest ease slightly. Not gone, not healed, but less suffocating. In Silas's presence, despair no longer felt permanent. Milan dabbed at her face, still unconvinced. "What if I'm not good enough?" Her voice cracked, as fragile as the question itself. Silas lowered himself onto the bench opposite her, his movements deliberate. A faint smile touched his lips. "The ones who care most always worry most, and caring is where real talent begins." The words landed gently, yet they stirred something inside her. She thought of Ephraim, of hours spent learning for him, of the trembling courage that had brought her to Asher. Was that caring not enough to mean something Silas didn't push further? He simply waited, eyes steady, letting the silence carry weight. Milan found herself holding the handkerchief tighter, considering the possibility that her weakness might in fact be strength. It wasn't certainty, it wasn't victory, but it was a seed, and seeds had a way of growing. The next morning, Milan slipped quietly back into her desk. Screens glowed, conversations hummed, and life carried on as if her collapse had never happened. But she carried the memory like a scar. Elodie passed by, her smirk sharpened into cruelty. "Learned your place." Yet the words stung, but Milan bit down, refusing to reply. Around her, colleagues exchanged whispers, their eyes flicking between her and their screens, unwilling to risk association. Silence was suffocating, but something small burned in her chest. Silas's words lingered, the handkerchief folded in her pocket like a reminder that standing back up mattered more than never falling. She lowered her eyes to her work fingers, steady this time. Her silence was not surrender. It was patience. From across the lobby, Silas lifted his chin in the faintest nod. Milan caught it and felt the ember inside her glow a little brighter. The management team sat stiffly as Harlan West's voice filled the boardroom, cold, precise, stripped of warmth. "We need people who see beyond numbers." The words were simple, but the weight behind them left executives shifting uncomfortably. He never spoke Milan's name yet. His eyes lingered long enough for unease to spread like a ripple. No one dared to challenge him. When the meeting ended, chatter resumed quickly as though noise could dissolve the tension. Harlan remained seated unmoving, watching the door close behind the last manager. Only then did he open the drawer at his side. The photograph lay where he always kept it, his daughter frozen mid-gesture, hands spelling, "Trust me." He traced the frame with one finger, silence pressing heavier than any agenda. Could the timid intern he had watched in the lobby, the girl dismissed by her peers, truly hold the spark he once believed lost forever? The question unsettled him, not because of doubt, but because of the fragile hope it carried. The following day, Milan walked through the corridor with her shoulders lowered, still carrying the sting of humiliation. A familiar figure approached Asher Lowell. His steps were calm, his expression composed. He lifted his hands, slow and deliberate. "Don't stop. You gave me hope?" Milan faltered, shame rushing back. Her reply was hesitant, barely visible. "I failed you." Asher shook his head, his gaze steady. "You failed yourself, not me." The simplicity of his words struck deeper than any lecture. For Asher, her effort had mattered more than the mistakes. He had lived long in a world where silence meant invisibility, and Milan had refused to let him vanish. That act, flawed as it was, carried weight. For the first time since the meeting, she felt a shift, a recognition that her worth wasn't destroyed by failure. It was still there, waiting for her to claim it. But hope was fragile at Westbridge. By the week's end, whispers thickened like fog. The CEO favors the intern. She's nothing but lucky. The source was invisible but deliberate. Elodie Vance moved like smoke planting doubts in break rooms, stirring suspicion during late hours. Colleagues who once ignored Milan now eyed her with guarded resentment. Their silence carried judgment sharper than words. The air in the department grew heavy. Conversations hushed when she entered. Smiles evaporated. The applause she never received before now turned into quiet hostility. Milan could feel it pressing against her back as she worked the weight of unspoken accusations. Her small spark of confidence dimmed beneath the glare of doubt. Every glance reminded her she was walking a tightrope suspended by rumor. One slip, and she would fall again, this time with no one to catch her. In a smaller team meeting, the tension wasn't as suffocating as the grand boardroom, but Milan still felt the weight of expectation. Her palms damp, she stood when asked to interpret a short exchange. At first her hands quivered hesitant like birds unsure of flight, but as the dialogue continued, rhythm found her. Gestures grew smoother, expressions steadier, the language beginning to flow. A whisper cut through the group. She's actually good. Surprise, not malice. For the first time, colleagues acknowledged her effort, but Elodie couldn't allow that spark to catch. She leaned forward, her smile sharp. Good enough for coffee runs, maybe. Laughter scattered weakly around the table, restoring the hierarchy. Milan sat down without protest. Yet her silence was different this time. Her eyes held light quiet, but undeniable. She knew she had faltered, but she had also moved forward, and no scorn could erase that truth. The office emptied long before Milan packed away her files. She stayed the glow of the desk lamp, her only companion. In the quiet, she raised her hands again, shaping signs over and over, repetition carving determination into sore muscles. Her fingers ached, reddened by hours of practice, but she pressed on. A video call lit up her screen. Ephraim's face appeared tired but smiling. His hands moved gently. Don't quit. She exhaled a laugh, escaping through exhaustion. Then she smiled back, lifted her hands, and signed in return, promising silently that she wouldn't. The screen light painted her features half-shadowed, half-burning with resolve. What had begun as desperation was becoming discipline. The timid intern who once vanished into corners now chose to fight her way into the light, one aching movement at a time. The next day, the boardroom filled with formality as Asher Lowell presented his community accessibility project. Executives leaned in, pens poised, their focus sharp. Milan stood at the side, called once more to interpret fragments when needed. Her hands shook at first, but steadied with each phrase. She stumbled over a technical term, corrected herself, and carried on. The errors remained, but so did progress. Her movements were clearer, her confidence less fragile. The council members exchanged glances, eyebrows raised not in mockery but in mild surprise. Recognition stirred not of perfection, but of effort. Elodie, seated nearby, pressed her lips thin, her composure cracking. For the first time, she felt her dominance threatened by the intern she dismissed as nothing. At the head of the table, Harlan West observed, unreadable. His silence was heavier than any applause, his gaze a mystery. Milan couldn't tell if he saw her growth or her flaws, but either way she had been noticed. Elodie Vance leaned close to a cluster of colleagues in the break room, her tone hushed but sharp. She's a threat. We need to act. Heads nodded, unease hardening into agreement. By the time the group dispersed, a faction had formed, bound not by loyalty but by shared resentment. Milan felt it almost immediately. A good morning went unanswered. Conversations cut off when she entered. Eyes followed her with thinly veiled disdain. The corridors she once drifted through unnoticed now felt hostile. Each glance a reminder that she was no longer ignored, she was targeted. Her chest tightened as she sank into her chair. Am I strong enough to survive this? The question clung to her ribs, heavy and unshakable. For the first time, invisibility seemed preferable to the suffocating weight of open hostility. Yet somewhere beneath the fear, a spark still glowed. The next strategic meeting began under strained silence. Executives shuffled papers, awaiting the interpreter, delayed once again. Anxiety buzzed until someone suggested Milan can fill in. Her hands trembled as she rose, but then she caught Asher's gaze. His steady nod grounded her. She exhaled and began. The signs flowed, halting at first, then steady, then confident. Technical terms landed cleanly, expressions matched tone, meaning carried intact. The room leaned forward, captivated not by spectacle, but by precision and grace. Silence followed her last phrase. But it was a silence of awe, not scorn. A manager murmured, "Remarkable." The word rippled like a quiet admission. Elodie sat stiff, her nails biting into her palms. The smirk she wore so easily had vanished, replaced by the weight of threat. For the first time, Milan's voice, silent yet unignorable, filled the room. After the meeting, an assistant delivered a summons. Milan's pulse raced as she entered the top-floor office. Harlan West stood by the window city skyline stretched behind him. He did not offer praise. He did not offer blame. Instead, he asked one question. "Why did you learn sign language?" The answer came quietly, but without hesitation. "For my brother. Because I couldn't watch him feel invisible." The words hung in the still air. Harlan turned slowly, his steel-gray eyes unreadable yet softened by something deeper. A memory surfaced unbidden, a little girl's hands, his daughter's hands shaping the words, "Trust me." A memory he had locked away now stirred open. He remained silent, but his gaze betrayed the fracture beneath the armor. For the first time, Milan saw not only the CEO but the man. The council gathered, expecting routine formality. Asher Lowell stood at the center, poised with quiet certainty. Then his hands moved, his words carried through the interpreter, but they were not what anyone anticipated. "I want Milan as my interpreter. Only her." The statement shattered the room's calm. Chairs shifted, breaths caught. The professional interpreter's face flushed crimson, shame and disbelief colliding. Whispered protest stirred among executives, yet none dared speak too loudly. At the corner, Elodie Vance froze. Her usual mask of superiority cracked, draining color from her cheeks. She had plotted Milan's downfall, fed rumors until they choked her, but in one sentence the power balance flipped. Milan's hands tightened in her lap. She looked around, waiting for someone to laugh to correct the misunderstanding. But no one did. The silence was a confirmation Asher had chosen her. And in that silence, a new fire sparked. The weight of Asher's demand still lingered when Harlan West leaned forward, his voice decisive. "Then she will lead." The council erupted in stunned silence. Mouths parted, but no words followed. No one challenged the CEO. No one dared. His authority sealed the declaration, turning Asher's wish into company law. Milan's chest tightened. "Led." The word clanged in her ears, heavy with responsibility she had never imagined. She glanced at Harlan, searching for clarity, but his face remained carved from stone. Across the room, Elodie pushed back her chair. Her smile was gone, replaced by a flash of venom in her eyes. Without a word, she slipped out, leaving only the echo of her resentment. Milan stood still, caught between disbelief and awe. The path that had been blocked at every turn had suddenly opened wide, but she knew instinctively with every step forward the opposition would strike harder. The signing ceremony drew a crowd, executives, department heads, employees, curious to witness history. At the front, Milan stood beside Asher, her hands moving with steady composure as she translated his vision. Confidence radiated, not loud, not forced, but grounded. Then Elodie rose. Her voice cut the air like glass shattering. "This is favoritism. She's unqualified." The room froze. Every head turned, eyes locked on Milan. Silence thickened, hot and suffocating, pressing down like molten metal. Milan's throat tightened. For a heartbeat, she felt the old instinct to shrink, to vanish. But the weight of Asher's trust, Silas's words, and her brother's face steadied her. Still, the accusation hung unchallenged, daring the council, daring Harlan, daring Milan herself to respond. The moment stretched unbearable, each second raising the stakes higher. The accusation still rang in the air when Milan turned calmly toward Asher. She lifted her hands, repeating Elodie's every word with clarity. "She says, this is favoritism. She says, I am unqualified." Her voice steady, her signing unwavering, Milan refused to soften or omit. She laid the attack bare for Asher to see, her expression unflinching. The tremor that once haunted her fingers was gone. Her gestures cut through the silence with precision. Elodie slammed her palm against the table. "Stop twisting my words." But Milan continued translating each outburst faithfully, her professionalism shining brighter with every phrase. She had no need to defend herself. Truth carried with composure was its own defense. Around the room, astonishment spread. Those who had dismissed her as fragile now saw something else, resilience forged in fire. As the tension peaked, Asher Lowell rose to his feet. His eyes burned with conviction, his hands slicing the air with deliberate certainty. Most interpreters translate words he signed. The interpreter's voice carried the message, but the force came from Asher himself. She translates humanity. The room gasped. Milan's chest tightened, tears pressing against her eyes. For years she had been invisible, then humiliated, yet here she stood affirmed not as a novice but as something greater. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling into thunder. Executive staff, even skeptics, found themselves swept by the undeniable truth in Asher's defense. Elodie, once triumphant, stood frozen. The crowd's approval drowned her. Her smirk shattered, her confidence collapsed. In the place of power, she found only silence and exposure. Milan, overwhelmed, bowed her head, caught between pride and disbelief. The applause still echoed when Harlan West finally stood. His presence silenced the room, his voice low, yet thunderous in weight. Milan will lead communications. Anyone questioning that questions me. The words cracked through the chamber like a decree. Authority wrapped around them, final and absolute. No one dared respond. Elodie's body stiffened. Her face drained of color, her hands clenched futilely at her sides. The walls she had built around her dominance caved in at once, leaving her exposed before all. The council sat motionless, their silence not of dissent, but of submission. Milan stood at the center of it, all bewildered, yet steady, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. Victory had found her in the very place humiliation once crushed her. She had weathered the storm and now stood at its calm center, carrying both the scars and the strength of survival. The room was dispersing when Harlan West approached Milan. His steps were measured, his expression unreadable, yet his voice trembled faintly as he spoke. "You remind me of my daughter." The words hung between them, fragile, unlike anything he had ever allowed others to hear. For years he had buried the image of her, the little girl with bright eyes and gentle hands, the one who once signed, "Trust me," before illness carried her away. He had built an empire of steel to protect himself from that loss, yet in Milan's quiet defiance he saw echoes of the same courage. The memory pressed hard against his chest, pain and hope entwined until he could not separate them. Harlan, the unshakable CEO, revealed not authority, but ache. And in that moment, Milan was no longer just an intern, she was a mirror reflecting the humanity he thought he had lost forever. Milan met his gaze steady despite the storm around them. "I'm not trying to be a hero," she said softly. "I just don't want anyone left behind." The simplicity of the words pierced Harlan's defenses more than eloquence ever could. His eyes glistened, moisture gathering where once only ice resided. For the first time in years, he felt less alone. 2 lives, 2 generations connected not by blood or ambition, but by kindness. She had spoken what his daughter once tried to teach him, that leadership was not power, but care, not dominance, but presence. They stood together in silence, the air heavy with shared understanding. No further explanation was needed. The language of empathy filled the space between them more powerfully than words. In that silence, Harlan's fortress cracked and Milan's quiet philosophy took root at the highest seat of power. 1 month later, the corridors of Westbridge felt different. Where once ambition alone set the tone, inclusion had taken root. Boardrooms now featured simultaneous interpreters. Company reports were produced in multiple languages. Meetings began with gestures of acknowledgement, not dismissive silence. Veteran employees walked through the changes with awe. They had seen Westbridge dominate markets, but they had never seen it care. The shift was undeniable, and it traced back to a single choice the day Milan Collins stepped forward when everyone else stood still. What began as one act of compassion had rippled outward, altering culture, policies, even hearts. Kindness had proven contagious, and what once seemed weakness now guided strength. Milan, once invisible, had lit a path others could follow, and Westbridge, the machine of profit, had grown a pulse, steady, human, alive. Ephraim stepped into the meeting room, eyes wide at the sight before him. His sister stood at the front, steady and composed, leading dialogue with confidence that filled the space. She was no longer the intern hiding in corners. She was guiding the room. When their eyes met, his hands lifted in the familiar rhythm. "Proud of you." This time, Milan didn't hide. Her face didn't shy away. She smiled, open, assured, radiant. The shyness that once defined her had melted away. For years, she had carried his gaze as her motivation. Now that same gaze reflected recognition. Milan wasn't just seen by her brother, she was seen by the world. At the back of the room, Silas Parker observed quietly, his features softened by pride. He had watched her stumble retreat and rise again. Now he whispered to himself, voice low but certain, "Finally. She is seen." His eyes glimmered with the fulfillment of a teacher watching a student step fully into their strength. Milan glanced back, sensing his presence. Their eyes met. She offered a gentle nod. Silas returned it, a silent exchange carrying more weight than applause. The moment passed in stillness, yet its echo lingered. It was not triumph shouted, but triumph acknowledged, quiet, steady, undeniable. Milan stepped onto the balcony, the city stretching wide beneath her. The breeze touched her face, carrying quiet clarity. She thought of the path behind her, the invisible intern, the frightened sister, the interpreter who faltered yet rose again. She was no longer unseen. She had become a light for others still hidden in the shadows. Her heart whispered the truth she had lived. Kindness once given always finds its way back. A calm smile broke across her lips. The journey had ended, and yet it had only just begun.